Welcome to our podcast. We are Becky and Belle sitting here on a Friday afternoon. We've got 2 large coffees and some sour gummies to get us through the afternoon. We're sitting here in my apartment and we're going to talk about our puzzle children. My cat may meow in the process, but don't listen to him. He is not an expert on literacy. He has nothing important to say, so you can just disregard him.
So the student that I've been working with this year is named Lucy, and a little bit about her. She is 6 years old and in the 1st grade. And prior to this year, she attended school. She went to kindergarten outside of the MNPS district. So her teacher had very little information about Lucy coming into the school year, but she noted through informal observations and working with her that Lucy seemed to have some difficulty with reading. So she recommended Lucy to me as someone who might be a good candidate to work with. And as I got to know Lucy and started assessing her, I found that she's a very energetic child, very social, and she has pretty positive attitudes towards learning. And I also found that Lucy was reading on an A level at the start of the school year. In terms of Lucy's classroom, she is one of 20 students, and her teacher uses a reader's workshop model in addition to following the scope and sequence and using the anchor texts that are outlined by the district.
So the student that I've been working with is named Frank. He's in 2nd grade. He is an English language learner. He speaks Kurdish at home, and he's really super connected to his Kurdish culture. They celebrate all of the Kurdish holidays. He speaks and he's literate in Kurdish. So he's a super charismatic kid. He loves animals. He changes his favorite animal literally every week. He likes peacocks one week and pandas the next week. Right now, he really likes bats. So that's one way that's kind of been an entry into literacy for us, because he's relatively disconnected from academics, but he does show interest in these really specific texts, like those animals that he's interested in, or sometimes he'll ask to read specific Disney texts. So that was a way that I really got to know Frank. When I first started working with Frank, he was a level G. That was assessed by his teacher. And I also did a running record with Frank and found that he was at a level G reading level. I began working with him because his teacher was having some problems with his literacy instruction. She wasn't totally sure what was going on. The one observation she made was that he was not self-monitoring at all. She said that he would read a text and read words completely incorrectly, and it would just not register at all that was an incorrect word, so he would keep moving. And my kind of goal when I first began instruction was to figure out why he was making those miscues and then teach him some strategies to begin self-monitoring so that he could increase his fluency. And the first semester, I did a lot of assessments, did a QRI, some phonics assessments, some sight word assessments, some informal decoding inventories and spelling inventories to really get at the root of the problem. But my biggest goal at the end of this whole experience was to get Frank to a place where he really enjoys his reading, and something like this does not happen again.
You want to try one more sentence?
No. Okay. So what were some of the strengths and areas for growth that you noticed with Frank? So after doing all of the assessments in the fall, I realized that he is really strong in his sight words. So he was successful through the 3rd grade Dolt sight word list, which is super impressive because he's in 2nd grade. And also something that I've learned in kind of some of our ELL classes is that that's often a coping strategy that ELL learners use, is they really rely on their sight word knowledge for reading. So I wasn't totally surprised to see that, but I was really happy that he had that strength. I also found that he's really interested in reading for super specific texts. So he will often request certain texts for us to read about whatever he's interested in the moment. He doesn't have a lot of interest in the day-to-day reading that he does in school, but he's interested in the things that he wants to read about. And then in terms of phonics, I did a couple of assessments of his phonics ability and his word reading ability through a phonics and word reading survey, an informal decoding inventory, and then a spelling inventory as well. And they all said the same thing, that he had a strength in blends, digraphs, and short vowels. Those are things he was really successful at. And then in terms of areas for instruction,
I found that across all of those phonics surveys, he really struggled with vowel teams and long vowel patterns. So I'll talk about that more in my instruction, but that's something that I really kind of honed in on for our instruction, vowel teams and long vowel patterns. And then based on his teacher's observations and some of my just general observations of him reading, some anecdotal evidence, I was noticing that it doesn't self-monitor his reading at all for meaning, and he doesn't have a huge bank of word attack strategies when he comes across a word he doesn't know. And this lack of fluency, because of the lack of self-monitoring, it just kind of hinders his comprehension. So that was also something I wanted to focus on.
Nice.
How about you?
So for my student, Lucy, some of her strengths were consonant sounds, so she knew all of her consonant sounds and her short vowel sounds in isolation. Another area of strength for her, I gave her a phonological awareness assessment, and blending and segmenting were two skills that she really has mastered, which is something that was reflected in her FAST screener data. She was in the 85th percentile for word segmenting.
Wow.
So that was impressive. And kind of along with that, those three things that she has really mastered, the consonant sounds, the short vowel sounds, and the blending and segmenting, she was very successful in reading CVC words in particular, and decoding unknown CVC words. But then in terms of areas for instruction, also from that phonological awareness assessment, I found that phoneme manipulation in particular was a skill that she needed some support with. So deletions, substituting phonemes, those are some areas where she had a little bit more difficulty, specifically with those tasks that required a lot of working memory, like required her to hold a lot of information in her head and manipulate it. Also, in terms of phonics, long vowel sounds were another area where she had difficulty in assessing her knowledge of vowel sounds. Like I said, she got all the short vowel sounds, and then when I asked her to name the long vowel sounds, she wasn't able to do that. It was interesting because I first, asked her, what's the long vowel sound for this letter? And if it was A, she would go, ah, so kind of make the letter long. But then I asked her, what does this vowel say when it says its name? And what is the other sound that this vowel can make? And she wasn't sure. So that was one area that we targeted through instruction.
But she knew all of her letter names.
Knew all of her letter names. And then also with her, found that consonant blends and vowel teams were another area for support. And then in addition, another big kind of area for instruction for Lucy is sight words, and I'll talk about that a little bit later again in my instructional implications, but at the beginning of the year, using the Fry sight word inventory, she only knew about 12 sight words from the list that we started with, so that was another area to work on, in addition with word solving strategies and self-monitoring.
So based on all of those strengths and areas for instruction or areas for support, what was your initial instructional plan for Lucy? And did it change at all?
Yeah, so at first, my instructional plan for Lucy was really largely informed by Adams, by taking a bottom-up approach. And I was really thinking about targeting the phonological and the orthographic processors and really helping her learn those spelling patterns that she had difficulty with, like the consonant blends and the long vowel sounds and the vowel teams. And I think for me, because first grade is a time when those phonics skills are so heavily targeted, at first I was really focused on making sure that she learned those spelling patterns before she left the first grade.
Right.
And I also thought that would help to get her into some higher level text. So the first three areas that I targeted were sight words, then those phonics skills, the long vowels, consonant blends, and vowel teams, and then phoneme manipulation. So I'll kind of go into what I did for each three of those. So with sight words, so much of what's in those level A, B, and C books are sight words. That's what makes up the majority of the text. And so on the TLA assessments, I was finding that Lucy was really held back by sight words. The majority of her miscues came from sight words. So I wanted to target that, and thinking about Adam's ideas about automaticity and cementing those pathways. I wanted to try to decrease the cognitive load Lucy had while she was reading, so that those words just came to her and she didn't have to spend time trying to decode words she couldn't decode.
Right.
So for that, we made a sight word ring together, so we would practice like 5 words a week, and once she mastered them, I'd add them to her ring, and those would go into her book box, and she would practice them even when I wasn't there before her independent reading time. And I think I tried to make it fun and frame her kind of as like a detective when I gave her cards. So I would like say they were mystery cards, turn them over, and try to position her kind of as the expert in helping me to figure out what the words were. So sight words were that first area.
It's interesting, this is kind of an aside, but going back to like those A, B, and C readers, it's interesting that when phonics is such a heavy focus in first grade, that those readers are then targeting sight words.
Yeah, and I think that like that kind of, I'll get into this in a minute, but my change in instruction kind of came through realizing that those phonics skills weren't really helping her in those A, B, and C readers. So moving into the next thing that I was focused on were those long vowel sounds, the vowel teams and consonant blends. And again, this was really influenced by the work of Adams and talking about learning and recognizing spelling patterns. So to help Lucy with this area of instruction, we did a lot of work with like letter tiles. So I would give her a word and have her build it with letter tiles. And I tried to bring in kind of the sounds that we were working on, and she loved this. Like, she loved working with the tiles. Every time I came, she would be like, "Can we do the words now?" Like, it was her favorite thing, which is funny. And then we also did a lot of word sorts, so picture sorts between short and long vowel sounds, or different ways to spell, like the long E sound, for example. So practicing sound discrimination and also practicing the different ways to spell those long vowel sounds. And then with phoneme manipulation, I kind of targeted that as well through the letter tiles. So seeing if she could hear the difference between hot and hat, and what letter do you need to change to make that difference. So that was kind of the focus of my instruction. But then in wanting to keep a balanced literacy approach, like thinking about Short, who says we need to learn language, learn about language, and learn through language, I also wanted to provide time for her to read authentic text. So I wanted to balance those two, which became kind of difficult with the time constraint of 30 minutes that we had to work together. But so in order to kind of target that area as well, my goal was to teach word solving strategies, to have Lucy independently solve words that she didn't know, rather than Allington talks about how struggling readers come to kind of expect teachers to correct them, and there's this kind of learned helplessness that comes with that. And so I wanted to give her the strategies that she needed to solve those words on her own, and to feel confident doing that. But kind of after, I don't know, maybe the first month and a half, Lucy was still, she had mastered all these like phonics skills in isolation. She was reading individual words, but when we got into a text, it wasn't clicking. And I think part of that was because these skills really weren't in the text that she was reading. So she was still reading on a B at that point, so I decided to kind of shift my approach. And I was really, a lot of this came from after reading that book, Striving to Thriving, and reading about the work that Harvey and Ward did, and also drawing on the work of Allington, thinking about how struggling readers are so much more likely to spend less time reading, and when they are reading, they're reading aloud, they're being corrected by a teacher, and they're also practicing skills in isolation so much more. And after reading that, I was like, that's exactly what I'm doing with Lucy, and it's not working. And you know, both Allington and Harvey and Ward say that what struggling readers need is high success reading. They need to read texts they're interested in, and they need to like develop a confidence and a self-image as a reader. So starting in the beginning of March, my instruction really shifted. I was really focused on finding texts that Lucy was interested in, which like honestly mostly happened to be books about dogs. Like that was her thing.
Same.
So like pulling in a lot of books that she was interested in, and really spending the majority of our 30 minutes like reading together. That was what we did.
So here's a clip of Lucy reading the book Superdog, which was one of her favorites that we read this semester.
"You are not flying, said Daisy. It's time for lunch, said Jack."
And also in that time, trying to ensure that that learned helplessness wasn't developing. So in finding that teaching the word solving strategies wasn't really clicking, I decided, because I think before you can word solve, you have to self-monitor. You have to recognize when you don't know a word. And that piece is something that was missing. There wasn't a lot of self-monitoring going on. It would be, okay, I see the first letter, I see the picture, I'm just going to guess a word, and I'm not going to ask myself if that made sense. So in this like heavy reading that we were doing, I also made a bookmark that Lucy could have as a resource. And it was really simple. It was words and pictures. Does it look right with a picture of an eye? Does it sound right with a picture of an ear? And then does it make sense, with a thought bubble?
Right.
So here's a quick clip of Lucy reviewing her strategies before we read.
Do it look right? Do it sound right? Do it make sense?
Good. So when we're reading, we're going to ask ourselves these questions, right? Perfect. Okay. And rather than trying to work on these like word solving phonics based strategies, the first thing I wanted to get down was, as I'm reading, here's how I monitor myself. And really trying to step back and not be the one to say, did that make sense?
Right.
But having her recognize that on her own.
Right.
So that was how my instruction kind of shifted in the second half of this semester, from being a really bottom-up phonics-based approach to then stepping back and thinking more about providing opportunities for high success reading and creating an image of her as a reader. What about your plan for Frank? What was your initial plan? Did it change at all throughout the semester?
So it's like we went to graduate school together or something. A lot of my instructional plan is focused on a lot of the same theorists and researchers, but it's funny because it took kind of a different lens. So I too began the semester with some really explicit phonics instruction, but that stuck in my plan for the entire semester because I was finding it to be successful. So I drew a lot on Adam's bottom-up approach and thinking about structured literacy and giving Frank explicit practice with these sounds that he was missing. So we did things like using Alconin boxes to build words. We made a lot of word lists just using the whatever team we were working on. He really enjoyed, I would write a paragraph that had a lot of the vowel team in it. He would go through and highlight and then add them to our word list. He enjoyed that. We played games. So I tried to kind of give him the practice with these vowel teams in context and out of context. So I tried to make it so that he was reading the words independently and practicing the vowel teams independently, but then with things like the paragraph, he was also reading them within a broader context. And I found that to be really successful with him, so it's interesting that we had really different experiences with that, and I like that makes me think it's a reader thing, like when thinking about text complexity and thinking about like the task and the reader and all those different things, that like the reader has to play a huge role in how we determine text complexity.
And what level text was Frank reading, like when you all started?
So he started at a G.
Okay.
And so he was reading higher level text than Lucy, so he could apply his skills more readily. And he was, like when we would start reading together, he would pick out vowel teams. He'd be like, oh, there's the vowel team we're talking about. Like, that one makes EE, and it was so fun to watch. So with that explicit phonics instruction, I was thinking about Leland and Harst and thinking about multiple ways of knowing and making sure that he was getting all of these vowel teams in multiple contexts, so he was building different pathways. And then similar to Lucy, it sounds like the other kind of, so there were two big parts to my instruction. One was the phonics instruction with the vowel teams, specifically because that was driven by the data from the fall. And then the second half was that I realized very quickly when I began working with Frank that he had a lot of behavioral characteristics of a struggling reader. He had a lot of the learned helplessness you were talking about. He didn't have a lot of strategies for word attack skills, and he just looked to me constantly to provide him with clues and to provide him with next steps for his reading. And that was something that I really wanted to dissuade him from using, that like, I'm not a strategy. And I think that some of that stems from a lack of individualized attention in the classroom. I think in terms of like school context, whenever I said that Frank was the student I was working with, anyone I told that was like, ooh, like that must be kind of tough. How's that going? So I think he kind of has a reputation as a difficult kid, and his parents I know also have a reputation thinking about the whole child.
I wonder how he's like internalized that to some extent.
Right. So I think that like people have kind of pushed him aside. Teachers have kind of pushed him aside as like a difficult kid. What am I going to do about it? So just thinking about like equity versus equality, and Terry and Klinger's work on moving away from the deficit model and moving more towards an asset-based model for struggling readers. He does not have any sort of diagnosis, but he does have he exhibits a lot of behaviors of struggling readers. So anyways, that's all to say that the second portion of our lesson, we would always begin with the phonics stuff, and then we move into just reading a story together. And between the phonics instruction and reading the story, we would go over a specific word or text strategy. So we had a bookmark that we used.